I'm Michael Knowles filling in. I'm the author of the upcoming book, Speechless, Controlling Words, Controlling Minds. You may have heard that. I may have mentioned that once or twice. You don't need to take my word for it that you should read this book. There are plenty of people who have blurbed it and given it nice endorsements. Ben, believe it or not, that's the first time he's ever said anything nice about me. Senator Cruz gave it a nice endorsement. Secretary of State Pompeo was very, very nice about it. Ambassador Haley. And I think, more impressive than any of them, Madeleine Kearns, a staff writer at National Review, contributor to The Spectator, one of the great writers around journalism today, especially on this issue of transgenderism. So if you think that I'm lying about Maddie Kearns endorsing my book, you can hear it from her right now. We have Maddie on the line. Maddie, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having me, Michael. And you're right, I did endorse the book. It's a brilliant book. I highly recommend it to everyone out there.
And you didn't even charge me that much to endorse it. It was a very 5 figures, but it could have been higher. So thank you very much for that. I greatly appreciate it.
Pleasure.
I have you on basically every time I can consider you the guest co-host of the Ben Shapiro Show when I come on, because while your journalistic focus seems somewhat narrow, it's this transgender issue, how it's affecting kids, how it's affecting sports, that niche topic seems to be, dominating the headlines all the time these days. And I do want to get into a little bit of the transgender of it all, but I want to focus on something you wrote about just yesterday, the day before, that is, one might say, a consequence, or at least an associated phenomenon, which is the fact that our civilization is dying. I don't mean this in the rend your garments, gnash your teeth sort of typical conservative way of everything's going to hell in a handbasket. I mean it in a very technical sense. We are dying. We are not having enough babies, and so we're not replacing the people who are shaking off this mortal coil. And if that goes on long enough, we're not going to have a country or a civilization left.
That's exactly right. And so the latest news hook in this area, this topic, is the declining birth rates. The CDC has come out with another report, a very stark report, a 4% drop from last year and a new low. And every few years we get this new low. Oh, it's a new low, is it? And the same conversation happens about what might be contributing to this. Lots of people will get very exercised about the economic angle, and that's all very well and good. What sort of things are putting people off having children, or at least delaying having children? But I see it as perhaps even more stark than that. I think that this is something that has been happening underway for a century, and the latter part of the last century really just thumped marriage, and therefore thumped babies. I'm now having to explain that these things are connected. Marriage and babies are connected, in fact. And as you say, Michael, that's not sustainable. A civilization that doesn't replace itself, or doesn't know how to rear children, produce and rear children in a way that creates strong, well-adjusted individuals who will contribute meaningfully to the society, is not in a very good way. And I think that there's not really any sign that we're going to do a turn on this, unfortunately. In
the words of the well-known political philosopher Frank Sinatra, love and marriage go together like a horse and carriage. Dad was told by mother, you can't have one without the other. And that this would appear to be correct, because there are fewer babies, fewer marriages. Marriage has now reached an historic low, and a lot less love, if you dare permit me to make a romantic observation here. It just seems like the relationship between the sexes is at an all-time low. We don't even know what sex is anymore. And so these seem to be related. It's not just the last 2 years or 3 years or 5 years. As you point out, this has been going on for about 50 years. So what happened, and how do we fix it? So lots of things happened, but I think what we did culturally was we detached sex from procreation. We found this exciting new technology which allowed women, or at least was said to allow women into the workplace, the contraceptive pill. And when this became very, very common to use, sex was no longer necessarily about babies. You also had the fallback of abortion, of course. And as you say, at the same time, we had all these new cutting edge new theories about human anthropology, about what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman. And we emasculated men. So we have a whole generation, or several generations, of Peter Pans, I think. And we inspired women with a deep rooted sense of grievance
that men are awful and terrible and the patriarchy is the root cause of all evil in the world. And the result of that has been, of course, that men and women have a hard time impressing one another and committing to one another for life, which is really what is needed, I would argue, to rear children. Is you need the biological parents, ideally the biological parents of those children, committed to one another for life. And that is very difficult post-sexual revolution, and is extremely difficult now we have this subsequent gender revolution. And the gender revolution, as you know and referred to, is about denying the existence of male and female, collapsing the categories entirely. So I don't know how you make a comeback from that either.
So we know that the left screwed a lot of this up. You have the Gloria Steinems saying that a woman needs a man like a fish needs a bicycle. The left pushing radical ideas of sex, which then they seem to be talking out of both sides of their mouths, because on the one hand they encourage promiscuous sex all the time, and then on the other they reclassify manifestly consensual sex as rape if there's any sort of question about regret perhaps, or intoxication, which they've also encouraged on campus. So they got a lot of problems. Okay. But it takes two to tango. And it would seem to me that the right has given in quite a lot here. And the right in some ways has even adopted the left's arguments here. So, okay, if we're not going to convince the left anytime soon, what can we do who actually think this is a problem and we want to fix it?
That's exactly right. I think there's no clearer example of this with the same-sex marriage debate that happened about 10 years ago. Where, and to be clear, I don't think that same-sex marriage is the cause of of any of this. It's merely a symptom. Same-sex relationships are, by definition, not about procreation. And this was the logical endpoint of taking away the procreative element. And it's very clear when you look at polling that the general public do not see procreation as necessarily anything to do with marriage at all. And that's been true way before gay marriage was on the scene. But the same-sex marriage thing is really, really interesting, because I think that's when we became aware that social conservatives, if indeed there are any, were very slow to articulate what marriage is. In fact, they only really did it after the whole thing had been fought and won by the left, and they did it in such a way that was kind of rambling and confused. And I don't want to say everybody did this. There were obviously some people who really give a very good effort. Robert George, Ryan Anderson, those types. But I think what it showed was just how the train had already left the station, and that, as I say, is nothing recent. That has been underway for a century, and especially speeded up post 1950.
You quote Robbie George and others. I might quote the philosopher Norm Macdonald, who famously said in one of his stand-up routines that sex is obviously a filthy, shameful thing only meant for procreation. And he gave this line in a comedy club in San Francisco, of all places. And his point is, he's being a little hyperbolic here, but he obviously is making a good point, which is there is a purpose to sex. And we all used to understand that, and we have faculties of moral conscience and shame that let us know this sort of thing. He jokingly he referred to having a one-night stand, and they went home from the bar, and they went and started to get undressed, and then he realized that this was extremely disordered and bizarre. You don't do this sort of thing to a stranger, and then they went home. But the right, I find, just echoes the left's arguments. They say, well, look, you don't need to have children. Look, the family arrangement, it can be any sort of arrangement with any number of sexes. It just has to involve consent. And whatever I want to do in my private judgment is, by definition, good, according to some of these so-called conservatives.
Yeah, that's right. I think this is yet another example, and I know this is something we've talked about a lot, Michael, that the dominant force in conservatism at the moment seems to be this libertarianism as opposed to social or cultural conservatism. And you're quite right. It's a false notion of freedom. Conservatives believe in pieties and obligations and responsibility, that very scary word. And libertarians are much more about freedom, as in freedom to do whatever the hell I want to do. And that has been, I think, damaging on the right as well as on the left. You mentioned there the kind of realization of the immensity of this reproductive capability of sex. And, it strikes me that this is potentially the most significant thing most of us will ever do, if we do indeed do it, is parent a child, as in create another human being with a sexual partner. And in many years' time, when we're all in the ground, and I hate to get morbid here, but I'm Scottish. I'm Scottish. Can't talk about sex without death. One of the most significant things that we will ever do is, if anybody remembers us at all in 50, 100 years, short of being the first man on the moon, or that's already taken, or, finding the cure to cancer, most people will be survived by that legacy of parenthood. It's cosmic. It's a pretty astonishing thing. And we take that for granted, and we think it's not really that significant, not really that important. And just the promiscuity is obviously another strange and bizarre element of all this. You mentioned the left's incoherence on this. I find that the syllogism of modern feminism seems to be that all consensual sex is fine, all non-consensual sex is not fine. Therefore, any sex that is not fine must be non-consensual.
That's a great observation.
Yeah. Which really is was a fallacy, but you can kind of get your head around that logic. You reference things like shame or regret or just a realization that this probably wasn't a terribly good idea, but I have this unpleasant feeling. I must have been raped is something some people resort to, which is very unfortunate, causes a lot of problems.
Right. Was it you who wrote a piece called Bring Back the Slap? Was that? I think it was, wasn't it?
That was me, yes.
Oh, I loved it. I genuinely couldn't remember for a second, but it sounded so much like you. I assumed it was you. I loved this point because we're now in this world where we're told men and women look at sex the same way. They have no cares about their relationships or their community. It's all just self-interest, and we all have exactly the same interest in sex, and so everything's got to be a notarized contract before you can go, round second base or something. But what you pointed out is, no, men pursue women. Women, generally speaking, are pursued, and when men get a little frisky, it's perfectly right to give them a smack across the face.
Absolutely. I think this has been tried and tested. This is certainly something my grandmother did when she was a young bonny lass. I think this makes perfect sense. And of course, the idea of that was that it was an insult to presume sexual familiarity with a woman, especially when we've just met. So if a guy comes over and puts his arm around you or pinches your bottom or something like that, you slap him that you're insulted. How dare you? I'm not that kind of girl. Thank you very much. And that usually did the trick, and because the thing is the relationship between the sexes is it's clumsy and it's awkward. And this is why we had before wokeness ruined comedy, we had a whole genre of comedy based on the differences between the sexes, because there is something inherently quite funny about that complete difference. And, men being baffled and thinking, I thought that was a winning strategy, and a girl setting him straight. But and rather than having to go off, something like that happens, you sit in it for months, and then you go over to a HR department. I mean, how is that empowering to women, really? Right.
Of course, it's far more empowering to say, "Listen, Buster, you're gonna get out of here. You give me a break." Yeah. I know this. This is advice that reminds me of what Don Corleone said to Johnny Fontaine in The Godfather. When Johnny Fontaine's crying, he says, "I don't know what to do," and Don Corleone shakes him and says, "You're gonna act like a man. What's the matter with you?" That's so much of this problem, I suppose, comes down to you can act like a man. And very tricky because the men have been emasculated, and that's their problem now too. So we've got about 20 seconds left, Maddie. How do we resuscitate the civilization, get the birth rates in the other direction, get men and women to love one another again, get married so that they, in the proper definition of marriage? How do we fix everything? We got about 10 seconds.
Well, I'm a conservative, so I'm going to just say, don't try fix the culture, fix yourself. And that will be attractive, and people will see that, and your friends will start coming to you for advice. And if everybody did that, then we'd be in a lot better position.
Coming back to the other political philosopher, Michael Jackson, start with the man in the mirror. Ask him to change his ways. Madeleine Kearns, go check her out at National Review and Twitter and everywhere else.